the idea, Russell, is not just to attack Western society as such. It's to attack nationalism. It's to attack the family. It's to attack religion. It's to attack any bounds of solidarity that holds society together. And it's a plan.
The issue is really to erode social bonds in order to have a generalized enemy, a generalized alienation. Good morning, good evening to my co-panelists and the audience. I'm happy to be here. I want to share some thoughts about universities and what we learned about them in the wake of October 7th. There are certainly deep and substantive problems inside academia that explain current campus events, and I will turn to them in a moment. But it is important first, I think, to take stock of what has genuinely transpired and not surrender to sensationalist overstatements. It is true that demonstrations and disruptions have taken place at many colleges and universities, but the number of participants at each has been limited, measured against total enrollment. There were 119 arrests at Columbia, where the student body totals some 36,000. It is also true that anti-Semitic discourse has erupted, but the extent of its spread is unclear. At Stanford, where I teach, a student vote calling for divestment from Israel won 75% support, which is disheartening. But only 25% of eligible voters took part. So the result only documents an anti-Israel sentiment of about 18% of the student body. We need more data in general. From the arrest records, we learn that many of the protesters have not been students or faculty members, but came from outside activist organizations. At Columbia, 32 of the 119 were outsiders. At City College of New York, 102 of the 173 were not from the university. There's enough evidence to point to a coordinated plan by groups to promote disruption, to commit crimes, and especially to radicalize the discourse. By radicalizing, I mean the following. Consider, for example, a well-meaning student attracted to the logic of a two-state solution, not an extremist position by any means, who might show up at an encampment and then be pushed into supporting Hamas or the elimination of Israel, indisputably extreme stances. That radicalization has gone unquestioned. There are no signs of internal debate between, for example, supporters of Palestinian national self-determination on the one hand, and on the other, proponents of global intifada and smashing capitalism. It's not hard to determine that these are two different programs, but radical leadership has managed to establish the latter as the norm in the protest camps. It has also left previously unorganized students facing the consequences of arrest and potentially a criminal conviction. So everyone has free speech rights to protest, but no one has the right to conspire to commit crimes or promote violence against property or persons. I think the FBI should be investigating not the speech, but the crimes. But let's not make this too easy. This outside agitation has only become effective because of weakness on the inside of universities. We need to take a closer look. Where exactly is the problem? I'm going to leave aside the question of elite universities versus less elite. That maybe that will come up in discussion. I don't think it's that interesting, but something else. At one point during the autumn, two competing faculty petitions circulated at Columbia. The anti-Israel document, that is, the petition in which faculty declared support for the pro-Hamas camp, attracted signatures primarily from the humanities, while the statement that tilted toward the Israeli side found support in STEM and medicine. Similarly, a recent letter from Indiana University decrying campus anti-Semitism showing 56 signatures altogether, has only 12 from the humanities, half of which are from Jewish studies faculty, only 1 from philosophy, and none from English. In contrast, supporters of the Indiana letter came from STEM, medicine, social science, and business. This discrepancy shows how the dissemination of radical activist views, is especially rooted in the culture of the humanities disciplines. Scientists are just less prone to ideology than are scholars in the interpretive fields. The further you get away from science, the greater the propaganda quotient. As I said before, we need more data. Those are just 2 examples of petitions. We don't know exactly how they circulated, who initiated them. That might bias the results. Nonetheless, I think the evidence is indicative. Now, second matter, the anti-Semitism. There can be no doubt that anti-Semitism plays a role in the current activist mobilization. For now, one can leave aside the familiar, and I think by now answered question of whether anti-Zionism is necessarily anti-Semitism. But let's simply dwell on the shouts of "go back to Brooklyn," which we heard at Stanford, or "go back to Poland," reported from New York. Brooklyn, a nice place actually, obviously stands for a venue presumed to have a large Jewish community. And the reference to Poland involves the false claim that all Israelis are of East European origin, or that all of East Europe is Poland. It also carries the implication of going back to the extermination camps, like Auschwitz, that the Germans set up in Poland. The protesters, I think, have to own that implication. Moreover, this "go back to" rhetoric from the notional left is revealingly indistinguishable from the posture of the anti-immigrant right, with its own hope that the undocumented aliens go back to their countries of origin, presumably in Latin America. No one likes immigrants these days, not even the Hamas fans. In any case, it is not a stretch to treat those tickets to Poland as indisputably anti-Semitic. We can only speculate on the sources of this anti-Semitism. Some of it may involve a resurgence of latent tendencies in Western culture, while some certainly involves anti-Semitic strands in various Muslim cultures. It is likely that the process of radicalization in the protests involves an intentional breaking through conventional cultural taboos, including the articulation of anti-Semitism. It's the excitement of doing something forbidden. In addition, the deleterious impact of DEI ideology, which first vilifies whites and then identifies Jews as white, provides a vulnerable scapegoat for the mob. Yet the campus responses to October 7th do not only promote anti-Israel or anti-Semitic predispositions. The protesters make this clear. The arguments criticizing Israel are typically framed by denunciations of Western imperialism and especially the United States. The anti-Israelism in higher education is, I therefore argue, a transparent cover for an anti-Americanism. And frankly, I'd argue that the anti-Semitism is a transparent cover for a hostility to Christianity. No wonder then that the vilification of Genocide Joe long ago surpassed the personalization of antagonism toward Netanyahu. Viewed from this point of view, elite education has not only regressed to its historic norm as an environment for a no longer genteel anti-Semitism. Higher education has become a breeding ground for a principled hostility toward the Higher education, especially in the United States, has become a breeding ground for a principled hostility toward the United States, toward capitalism, and toward Western values, linked via intersectionality to patriarchy, heterosexuality, and climate change. You can't just support Gaza, you have to buy the whole package. The rhetoric of the protests demonstrates how campuses have normalized hostility to the United States and to capitalism. This dissemination of anti-American indoctrination has led to physical and violent disruptions on and off campus. This means that higher education has become a national security risk in the United States in multiple ways. Let me point out 3. First, in case of a U.S. involvement, a direct involvement in a war in response to a threat to the homeland, campuses will serve as staging grounds for disruptive resistance, such as blocking highways or airport access. The recent demonstrations have been dress rehearsals for that kind of fifth column activism. If a threat were to emerge that required direct U.S. engagement, for example, an October 7th style assault along the American southern border, we can count on university radicals to try to undermine the military mobilization, as they put it, by any means necessary. Second, the ideological anti-Americanism in higher education offers cover for illicit technology transfer from the sensitive STEM sector to international adversaries. Maintaining American superiority in technological innovation is vital for U.S. national security. The more anti-Americanism dominates the universities, the more likely that technology espionage takes place. Higher education is ill-equipped to manage this vulnerability. Third, national security threat. The anti-American and anti-capitalist mindset dominant in parts of academia will direct some compliant students eventually toward careers that involve cooperation with foreign adversaries. No doubt some future Kim Philbys are already on the path to eventually work for Iran, China, Russia, and the DPRK, or for Islamist networks. I've included DPRK somehow incredibly, but at some of the protests we hear defenses of North Korea. No one would describe contemporary college curricula in the United States as providing an education to patriotism. The only question is how quickly indoctrination from campuses will lead to treason. So what is it that has transformed parts of higher education into systemic miseducation? Part of the answer involves the set of pseudo-ideas that is now entrenched in higher education curriculum, that melodramatic misrepresentation that human existence is always only the opposition between oppressors and oppressed. There's no other dimension to human life. The intellectual lessons drawn from uncritical readings of Marx and Fanon are amplified by the DEI administrative apparatus, which spreads a Manichaean struggle between good and evil, which is racialized into the fairy tale of people of color embattled by demonized whites. Cast as whites, Jews become targets. Higher education promotes the habit of vilifying whole groups. This is miseducation. A second matter involves a geographic decentering. Appreciative attention to the legacy of Western culture is long gone, just as there is no longer any expectation that education in the United States address American history, culture, or self-governance. Universities pretend that they do not inherit the tradition of the Western university because they insist that they have a global, not a national mission. The internationalization of the student body means a de-Americanization. Just track the admissions data. In the culture wars of the 1980s, neoconservatives like Alan Bloom bemoaned how the reception of Nietzsche had led to cultural relativism and nihilism, where no values were binding. In contrast, today, we now face a new age of dogmatism in which, against Nietzsche, good and evil reappear as absolute and non-negotiable, as if universities had reverted to an old-fashioned dogmatism. Nuance has been banished. But there are also structural problems that fuel the toxic processes that generated the responses to October 7th. Academic freedom and tenure are important principles of our intellectual life, but they did not have to lead to the current situation in which hiring and promotion decisions take place largely in the ideological bubble of departments with little institutional oversight. It is irresponsible that ideological departments are left free to hire their clones. Currently, the administrative ladder, deans and provosts, restricts itself to procedural rather than substantive review of departmental appointment decisions. The result is that faculty hiring and the enormous resources associated with it have been surrendered to ideologues. Academic freedom and shared governance did not have to turn into suicide pacts for higher education. So can all this be fixed? I hope so, but only if ambitious reforms like the following are undertaken. First, administrative oversight of hiring. Responsible administration must begin to oversee hiring and promotion closely. The university may not be able to fire a tenured anti-Semite due to structures of tenure, but no dean has to sign off on hiring a new one, even if a department supports it. Second, management of units. Facing an excessively ideological department or program, a dean has the capacity to reduce or eliminate its funding, for example, for graduate fellowships. The net result would be a slow but inexorable attrition of the unit. Third, de-radicalization. Some institutions have finally begun to use their authority to punish demonstrators who break clear rules. Refund the campus police. Maintaining campus order in order that learning can proceed means establishing limits and enforcing them, including through the prohibition of masks at protests. But de-radicalization also has to include dismantling the DEI hegemony over university processes that promotes generalizing stereotypes and hatred of groups. Equal opportunity by all means, but roll back the group hostility. Eliminate diversity statements. Fourth, promote civility. Message clearly that civil behavior is expected. It seems strange that it sounds radical to expect university community members to behave like adults. Develop pedagogy that promotes open-mindedness and respectful exchange of opinion. Ensure that representatives of the university, whether in classrooms or residence halls, promote civility and do not abuse their positions of authority to impose their personal political agendas. No misuse of the lectern to advocate for your preferred candidate. Admissions, 5. Meritocratic admissions have to be restored. Eliminating the SAT in the name of social justice has been a catastrophe. If institutions want to hold on to their elite reputation, admissions have to be elitist. Select against dogmatic closed-mindedness. In addition, the generalized anti-Americanism on campus tracks the growing number of wealthy international students whom institutions covet because admitting them is more lucrative. They don't have to give them financial aid. This is a bad business model. Here's my proposed alternative. The number of international students on campus should always be less than the number of US veterans who would have arrived having previously made an existential commitment to US national interest in a way that international students do not. Promote, therefore, veteran admissions. 6, development, fundraising. The donor class has to demand reforms. Those who have the means to make large grants to universities have to face the fact that once they make an endowment, they lose control. Universities are certainly not obligated to follow the will of donors, but neither is any donor obligated to give to a particular university. 7th, and my last recommendation, rule of law. Colleges and universities should face civil rights sanctions if they have allowed hostile environments to flourish. Board members should bear personal legal responsibility if they fail to oppose policies that endanger the institutions. I think lots of board members have just been asleep at the wheel. Foundations that fund protests where criminal acts transpire should be held responsible and treated as co-conspirators. And on this point, I want to give a shout out to Park McDougall, who wrote a great piece in Tablet today about how foundations have been funding these protests. The FBI should investigate conspiracies to coordinate disruptions and support for terrorist organizations. Anyone arrested should be prosecuted, although one can't count on prosecution being carried out by progressive district attorneys in some cities. Will these reforms be enough? Maybe not. Maybe the end of the university as we know it is upon us. I do hope the reform program will be effective, but let's see. The university as we know it may have outlived its historical moment. It may be coming to an end like the Hollywood studios of the past. The model is too expensive, and the student loan bubble hangs ominously over the nation's economy. We need new strategies to deliver professional qualifications more effectively and efficiently. The chaos after October 7th has made the dysfunction of the current higher education model clear to everyone. The dry rot throughout the structure enabled the collapse. The old university may be ending. What can higher education look like in the future? One way that evolution is already taking place is in the personnel. In the past, most college instruction was carried out by professors on tenure tracks. Some people may imagine that's still the case, but now some 75% of instruction belongs to lecturers and adjuncts with less job security, lower compensation, and no or little research expectations. And therefore, de facto, limited expectation of academic freedom. This is the real end of tenure. It's taking place before our eyes. Meanwhile, greater interest in career outcomes on the part of students, especially after the 2008 financial crisis, has meant a shift towards STEM majors and a concomitant denigration of traditional liberal arts education. So why not just focus on STEM and related fields like medicine, especially if the liberal arts departments are the source of the ideological indoctrination? Even Rashid Khalidi, the prominent promoter of Palestinianism at Columbia, concedes that it is in the college, not the professional schools, where the faculty promote activism. So maybe it's time to close the college. The obvious conclusion to draw is that the legacy university should be unbundled. Its different functions could be pulled apart and rebuilt in new structures. Most prominently, a primary function of contemporary higher education has become training in STEM, programming, CS, IT, AI, and related business practices. Packaging that together with required ideology courses is the equivalent of a cable TV offering with lots of channels you don't want to watch. The US is engaged in a great power competition with China and Russia, especially involving the pursuit of technological superiority. We are at a new Sputnik moment, not only in a space race, but an AI race as well, to which we should respond with new educational structures. We just don't need that liberal arts education to win the technology race, but we do need good technology training. One even more radical step. Let's just put all the instruction online across all fields and provide qualifying process through testing as a substitute for degree conferrals. Make it free and call that democratization. The campus experience that most Americans do not benefit from anyhow would disappear, but the education mission could take place at much lower costs, i.e., a much more efficient allocation of resources. Online education enhanced by AI may yet do to the traditional college what Amazon did to the old-style bookstore. The October 7th aftermath indicates that it is time to put aside childish things. We need a new model. So I am not myself gleeful about this pending end of the traditional university. Perhaps a reform-minded leadership with enough backing from boards and regents and support from Congress will forestall the demise of the legacy institutions. But otherwise, we need to move on to a more effective organization of teaching and research. The demonstrations in response to October 7th have shown how existing structures are probably not up to the task, and it may well be time to drain the swamp. Thank you.
Thank you, Russell, for those eloquent and thought-provoking remarks. I look forward to the conversation that will ensue in light of your presentation shortly. Meanwhile, up next is Professor Gadi Taub speaking about post-journalism, political activism, and October 7th.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to this great series, which I follow. And thank you for the kind introduction, Gabi. I wanted to just make a short point to support one of Russell's arguments, is that someone posted online the reactions of Jewish students and pro-Hamas students in UCLA when they called in the police. And the Jewish student was shouting USA, USA. And the Hamas students were shouting pigs go home, like from the 60s. So the contrast there was perfect, in that the real haters of Israel are actually haters of the United States and generally Western culture. But I have another topic, and it's centered on the experience in Israel, although I think it's valid throughout the West. So there's a top-down structure to public discourse. Ideas are created in universities, in books, in think tanks, governmental agencies such as national banks, bureaus of statistics, ministries, etc., and other centers of research and learning. They are then disseminated by professional academic schools such as law school, business schools, teacher training, as well as by the public education system that socializes children, and by the entertainment industry, and importantly, by the press. The upper echelons of these structures used to think of themselves in light of an ideal of science, where the production of knowledge is done with the same reverence for truth that one expects of a physics laboratory, and what has been thus produced and tested can be handed down. There is much to criticize about the presumption of the social sciences and the humanities to be like the natural sciences. And indeed, we generally no longer subscribe to ideals such as Bertrand Russell's or Auguste Comte, to hard empiricism or to logical positivism. A healthy dose of skepticism, and so also modesty, turned out to be in order, as well as a little pride in hermeneutics, which we believe, I think rightly, ever since we rediscovered Giambattista Vico, deserve our respect. There is much that literature and the study of literature can teach us about human lives and human society that statistics cannot. But a healthy dose of skepticism toward the scientific ideal of quantifiable truths in human lives is not the same as a rejection of objectivity and truth. And what happened in the age of postmodernism with the all-out attack on truth is not just a new respect for hermeneutics. Postmodernism has concocted a poisonous brew comprised of epistemological relativism and moral absolutism, which, when combined, amount to a license to lie, indeed an injunction to lie. The strange confidence postmodernists have in their skepticism, their certainty that everything is relative, is no more than a sloppy philosophical tangle of contradictions. This is why philosophy departments were generally among the last to fall. But their shoddy ethics are no better. The idea that the world can be divided into oppressed and oppressor, which has turned weakness into a substitute for virtue, provides a faulty moral compass that leads, as we have just seen, to chilling absurdities like blaming Hamas sexual sadism on its victims. The combination of the two multiplies the toxicity of both. Combine the disregard for factual truth with crusading, unquestioning dogmatism that tells you in advance who is virtuous and who is evil. That is, combine epistemological relativism with moral absolutism, and you get not just license, but a positive injunction to lie. Postmodernists have made their mission to provide moralistic falsehoods in order to elevate the perceived victims and force those designated as oppressors into rituals of self-flagellation designed to provide the self-indulgent illusion of moral purification. If there are no facts, and you can thus make up whatever evidence you wish, but there is also no doubt about the preconceived group-based moral judgment the combination yields with the predictability of a mathematical equation, pardon my positivist metaphor, a right, indeed an obligation to lie. If there are no discovered truth, only invented narratives, and if you know in advance that the weaker is the victim and the victim is always right, then it is incumbent upon you to construct a narrative which supports the anointed group and assails the one designated as evil, regardless of what the reality of the matter may be. So no matter how murderous, savage, and sadistic the crimes Palestinians inflict on whole communities and families, the story will be remolded to describe it as justified armed resistance, so said the oracle of gender gibberish, Professor Judith Butler, against an unjustifiable Israeli occupation, regardless of the fact that Gaza has not been under occupation since 2005, nor was it under siege under Israel since it has a border with Egypt. And this episode will, of course, fit in nicely with the larger story, excuse me, of the Palestinians as innocent indigenous people and Zionism as colonialism that sought to displace them, regardless of the fact that Israel and the Yishuv before it agreed repeatedly to partition plans, and the Palestinians never agreed to even one such proposal, no matter how generous. Once this postmodern view becomes dominant in the upper strata, where ideas are formed, where knowledge is produced, as we noted, universities, books, ministries, think tanks, etc., then the whole top-down structure is transformed. It is no longer a popularizer of truths or what is believed to be true. It becomes a moralistic system of indoctrination to which truth is at best irrelevant, at worst an obstacle. The intermediary strata, the press, has absorbed this worldview. It no longer seeks to inform, it seeks to inculcate the correct moral attitude regardless of truth. And it is as self-conscious about it as the producers of knowledge are. Journalism became indistinguishable from advertising. It consciously seeks to manipulate, since it too becomes flexible in its attitude to facts and rigid in its morality. This is not just a philosophical stance. It is also a pessimistic attitude towards democracy and liberty. People cannot be trusted to make good decisions based on a survey of reality, and should therefore be manipulated into making the choices we, the elites, know that they should make. Postmodernism made that stance philosophically legitimate. Journalists, when they talk about their own profession, tend to say that, as we know, objectivity is an obsolete ideal. Only uninformed laymen, we are told, still think there is such a thing as objective reporting. On the other hand, they are absolutely confident in the righteousness of their moral position, a whole set of progressive ideas in which dovish foreign policy is paramount in Israel. This is especially clear in our case, where peace, two states, the Oslo process, have a religious aura. As Henry Kissinger once remarked, Israelis talk about peace as one talks about religious redemption, not as an agreement between states based on mutual interests, but like a prophecy about the end of days. This was indeed the issue around which the Israeli mainstream press turned a corner. This was in the early days of the Oslo process. The press closed ranks to conceal the fact that Yasser Arafat was calling for jihad in Arabic, while half-heartedly speaking of peace in England. There's a strange anecdote here about Nahum Barnea, the most prominent columnist in Yediot Achronot, because Igal Karmon, who was a chief intelligence officer and an advisor on terrorism to two prime ministers, came to him in the early days of Oslo with a clunky old video cassette of the day with a translation of Arafat's speech calling for jihad. And Nahum Barnea told him that he won't publish that. And according to Igal Karmon's version, Barnea said to him, there's no such thing as truth. There are different stories promote different agendas, and yours promotes the cause of anti-peace. Nahum Barnea denies that this was his reasoning, but he doesn't deny that he refused to publish it. And so either way, the meaning of this is clear. Fast forward to the struggle over the reform. Here, we already see a new kind of press, a press that replaced the ideal of honest reporting with the ideal of political activism. A word of background. Israel was transformed over 3 decades from a democracy to a juristocracy. And the term is Ron Hirschel's from his book, Towards Juristocracy, The Origins and Consequences of the New Constitutionalism. Ever since the left lost power in 1977, it began to transfer centers of decision-making from electoral politics to the bureaucracy and most poignantly to the judiciary. In the slow process that largely went unacknowledged by the public, Israel's left-leaning Supreme Court annexed to itself more and more powers while shaking off any checks that could have served to balance its growing weight in the affairs of the state. Eventually, the court became Israel's Uber government. It also had its Praetorian Guard in the form of a highly politicized state prosecution. And so the power struggle between the judiciary and the elected branches of government at last became overt. That is how many Israelis began to see the criminal investigations against Netanyahu that are now falling apart in court, and later the indictments and the trial. It was also clear to a growing number of Israelis that the struggle between the elected branches of government and the judiciary was also a struggle between right and left, since the judiciary represents the progressive segment of the political spectrum. Most of it does. The press played a crucial role here. The indictments began as investigative pieces in the press, or else were based on information journalists pushed on the state attorney and the police, or in one case had to do with negotiations between the editor of a large daily, Nahum Barnea's paper, Yediot Achronot, and the prime minister. But the most interesting part in that investigation the investigation seemed to have less to do with uncovering truth and more to do with hurting Netanyahu's re-election prospect. That is, they were less about producing evidence and more about producing political dirt. The symbiosis between law enforcement and the press was its most conspicuous characteristic. We can be pretty sure of this now that we see the cases collapsing in court on account of a dearth of evidence. As I think is also true of the Russian collusion hoax in the US, so too in Israel. What we see is not the press working as the handmaid of politicized law enforcement agencies, but rather law enforcement agencies turning into the huge investigative arm of the press with the authority and invasive means that the press does not have, at least not legally. Many Israelis understood the Netanyahu investigation, later the trial, to be part of the juristocratic takeover of our politics. And this is how that episode spilled over into the battle over judicial reform. This is where the energy for the demand for a judicial reform came from. When after 4 rounds of elections, the right won a decisive victory, the coalition of 64 out of 120 in the Knesset announced a plan for judicial reform responding to the demands of their voters. From the very day the reform was announced, January 4th, 2024, the press mounted a campaign to stop it. This is how I was thrown out of Haaretz, by the way, for supporting the reform. The heart of it was a well-worked out and quite deliberate lie. The reform that was meant to restore democracy was portrayed by the press as the beginning of a messianic dictatorship. You should also see the hierarchy. You can also see the hierarchy of discourse in operations, because professors and judges invented false arguments, such as in Israel, the executive controls the legislator, and now it will also control the judiciary. Both parts of this statements are not true. It's a funny story, because the same people were arguing that the executive is too weak after the 3rd round of elections, I think, and came up with a non-democratic plan for a party to be able to rule without a majority in parliament. So the arguments changed by the same people. Then journalists repeated the lies, often citing the authority of professors, some knowingly, some unknowingly, I'm assuming, stoking fears of a takeover of the state by religious fanatics. The press concocted a brew potent enough to steer public hysteria, the alleged danger of aforementioned messianic dictatorship, till in the end the reform was defeated. I was in that fight from the beginning, and it's funny because no one on our side, the right side, ever thought that a messianic dictatorship was ever in the plan. So we knew that this was a lie. The aim of the campaign in the press was not to inform, it was to mislead about the facts in order to lead the public to the correct political position and keep power in the hands of the right kind of people, our people, the enlightened progressive people. Einat Wilf, the Israeli former member of Knesset and intellectual, Dr. Einat Wilf, said that the real struggle over the reform was a struggle over who is to rule, and that the right, although it won the election, didn't have, she said, deep legitimacy, only shallow electoral legitimacy, apparently. This transformation of the press is not unique to Israel, but it acquired great urgency here, since the right kind of people have the right kind of position about the most decisive issue in Israeli politics in the last 4 decades, at least, partition, the so-called two-state solution. And since the right kind of people know that their agenda, the Oslo agenda, will never again win in electoral politics on the merits of the case, it increasingly turned to manipulation at the expense of reporting and informing. By the time October 7th happened, the rift between right and left had grown, and the left-wing press had settled for its new mission, political activism and indoctrination. But first, in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, there was just shock. If all the previous efforts of the press were guided by the lodestar of the two-state solution, then it now seemed like the two-state solution is finally dead. Who in his right mind would risk another Hamastan, 15 times bigger than Gaza and perched over Israel's coastal plain, where its most important strategic assets are all located? It seemed that no sane person would gamble his family's life to live anywhere near a border of such a monstrosity. The deranged sadism of Hamas barbarity made it harder than ever before to imagine that this conflict was territorial. The support of most of the Palestinian population for the atrocities of the massacre, not to mention the enthusiasm for it, was everywhere on social media, and that drove that message home. The press, therefore, mostly settled for damage control, diverting attention from the real problems to the politically useful problems. I'll cut this part short, the politically useful or whatever they can argue against Netanyahu. The hope for toppling Netanyahu never changed, but the larger political goal, the two-state solution, seemed irrelevant. But then came the Biden administration and breathed new life into what should have been politically dead. The administration believed this was a chance to bring back the Palestinian Authority to Gaza on the bayonets of the IDF, and ending the split between Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, so that there would once again be a single political authority able to negotiate on behalf of the Palestinian people. And that single authority can be then brought back to the table to renew the two-state track negotiation. If Hamas could be weakened and brought under the wings of the Palestinian Authority, the administration reasoned, and the Israeli right-wing government toppled for not winning the war, then a chastened Israel can be forced to make further concessions, and maybe at long last, the Palestinians will acquiesce to partition. For the Israeli left, it seems like a dream come true. It seemed like the stars were perfectly aligned. Having given up on convincing the Israeli public long ago, it has, ever since the collapse of the Oslo framework, invested its hopes in American imposition. The US is the adult in the room, the logic went, and it would make Israel do what has to be done, and that would have already been done had the deplorable public understood its interests properly. So losing the war will topple the right. A weakened Israel with a moderate government will be more receptive to American pressure. A united Palestinian leadership would be, theoretically speaking, able to deliver. And best of all, finally, there's an American administration with the determination to force our hand. Absolutely perfect. Never mind that the Israeli electorate will reject any such foolish dreams and topple every government that indulges them. The press got to work on it anyway. It began pumping these messages. The war cannot be won. The hostages must be returned at any price, which meant including stopping the war short of victory. Eventually, some journalists even participated in the slander campaign that Israel was committing war crimes. I'm not talking about Haaretz. Haaretz goes without saying, but others too. I don't know if you saw Barak Ravid on Anderson Cooper saying outrageously that the command the soldiers get on the ground is to kill any male at fighting age. This is what he actually said. It should be noted that most of our press has not gone that far, but it is very active indeed in another campaign, well financed by the European money, to portray the settlers as uniquely violent. The campaign is built around a very small core of real, rare incidents supplemented with small incidents blown out of proportion others misleadingly describes, and also pure inventions and actual lies. For details, you can see Matan Peleg's Hebrew book, A State for Sale, How Foreign Countries Interfere with Israeli Politics. That too is part of the effort to promote a two-state solution. The campaign is designed to divert attention from the major source of violence in Judea and Samaria, Palestinian terror, to the victims of that terror, and so to promote the idea that there is a partner on the Palestinian side. Running out of time, so I'll skip most of the rest and say just that recent days we have seen this campaign go wildly out of control in support for a hostage deal, which allegedly Hamas accepted. What Hamas accepted was what Hamas suggested. It was not what Israel accepted. And since what happened just last Saturday is that the United States apparently was telling Hamas that it should sign the agreement of the return of the hostages without the demand that the war would be stopped, and that demand will be imposed on Israel later by the United States. When rumors of that began to leak into Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on a Saturday put out two messages saying Israel will not agree to end the war. So how did the press frame it? The press framed it, we are on the verge, on the cusp of an amazing deal, and Netanyahu, for his personal reasons, intercepted it because he doesn't want the deal. So if you look at what's going on in the press, the blatant lies, it's amazing. And most importantly, perhaps, the fact that the whole press campaign for the return of the hostages, anyone with a modicum of common sense knows that if you pressure the Israeli government for the return of the hostages, then Yahya Sinwar would sit back in Rafah and went to this and harden his terms and wait for this pressure to yield. And so cynically, the attempt to topple this current coalition is dressing itself in the clothes of a moral crusade to save the hostages, while that very moral crusade makes it harder for us to bring back the hostages. So this is the level of dishonesty and manipulation that the Israeli press has arrived at, and the result is amazingly harmful, because in the end, we just do not have public discourse on what we should be talking about. The existential danger to this state, the Iranian plan to destroy it, which is actually very smart and very effective, and the fact that for 20 years we have been building the wrong army to fight the wrong war, and now we are almost bereft of the military means to fight the war ahead of us. Thank you.
I don't think I spoke about immigration in particular, although I will, but rather the aspiration of universities to admit increasing numbers of international students, students from around the world who come and study in the United States. I don't oppose international students. I think they can enrich the environment on campus. But it's clear that the universities have a venal interest. Well, they have a venal interest and an ideological interest. The venal interest is they don't have to pay financial aid to international students. Therefore, the international students tend to be from the international elite. So there's really no social justice justification for this. But maybe even more important, the leading universities have ceased to see themselves as having any connection to the United States or the West. They see themselves as global universities, the best university in the world, not the best university in the United States. And that translates down into the curriculum. Therefore, the anti-Eurocentrism, therefore the disappearance of American history as essential to undergraduate education, therefore a promotion of global citizenship, whatever that means. Citizenship means voting. We don't vote in the globe. So in terms of the self-understanding of the university and how that translates into teaching and frankly research as well, there's a question about how national, how international. Universities in the United States benefit from the largesse of the tax code, from the decision by the government to make them tax-free. The government doesn't have to do that. And I think that there's increasing suspicion of the agenda operating in higher education that could well lead to congressional action in the future. With regard to immigration more broadly, I think there's of course the issue of the open southern border, which is a security question. More generally, I don't think immigration in the United States has led to the kinds of crises that we see in the European cities. In part maybe because the numbers, but in part also because so much of the immigration in the United States is from Catholic Christian South America, as opposed to from Muslim Middle East, which brings a whole different set of cultural challenges for integration. So I think in general, while it's not the case that there are no problems with immigration in the United States, integration processes are more successful in the U.S. than they have been in the welfare states of Europe, and maybe precisely because they're welfare states. Without the welfare state, immigrants have to figure out how to succeed, and the welfare state may be getting in the way of that in Sweden or elsewhere in Europe. I do know that in some countries in Europe, there's a discussion of sending immigrants back. In extreme cases, mass return. But in Germany, Habeck talked about returning those who are anti-Semitic. That has not been turned into practice. It's a nice idea, and I don't see European countries capable really of repatriating many immigrants for a variety of legal reasons.
May I respond?
Please, yes, Gadi, please.
The issue is slightly different here because of the law of return. Certainly, the progressive court is trying to punch holes in the law of return, but the essence is the same, because the progressives who promote the unlimited immigration, unlimited illegal immigration, are usually, at least in part, motivated by the attempt to dissolve nationalism, because they see their take on history is that all violence emerged from tribalism and then nationalism, and therefore what stands in the way of a better world is the fact that people do not mix enough. And so globalism is always portrayed as this benevolent universal regime of human rights, but Russell pointed at the crux of this. The problem in this is there is no citizenship. It's always these managerial utopias without any concept of political accountability. And this is what the erasure of borders is promoting. And now the press here is doing exactly what it does in Sweden. It lies about illegal immigration. It just, first they hid the crime statistics, which are about 3 to 4 times the average in Israel. In the south of Tel Aviv, where there's a large African, Ethiopian, Sudanian, and Eritrean community, mostly Eritrean. And then there were, the stories were just, Nissim Sofer, my friend, and I, when I did write for Haaretz, we used to pick their lies and just write stories about them. So they would have a story about this guy, this poor guy who was going to be deported to Eritrea, and he's 58. He's an old guy. He's being deported, and he's such an old guy. And he escaped to Israel when he was 35 to escape the forced draft to the Eritrean army. Well, apparently when he was 35, there was no Eritrean army. There was not even an Eritrea. And the the reporter in Haaretz, who is the specialist on immigration, didn't even know these basic facts, not to mention that they lie about everything else. We were told there was a whole campaign when there was a plan to transfer as many of them as possible to a third country, a safe third country. It was Uganda and Rwanda. A campaign began that they are being transferred to their death. When and apparently these were completely safe places. The UN agency for refugees puts African immigrants there in Uganda and Rwanda. It's perfectly safe. Then there were the I don't know how to call them, the nursing, the workforce that helps old people as private nurses, and some of them overstayed their work visa and then had children here. And so when they were about to be deported, they said, you don't deport children. And a whole campaign started here as if we are deporting them to Auschwitz. It was just amazing. The trains, the transfer, all the terms, the whole campaign. And the whole campaign was ridiculous. And the problem is, and they know what they're doing, and what they attempted to do was not, the question was not these, I don't know, 50 to 100 Philippine women with their single children. That was not the problem. The problem is, if you turn birthright to citizenship in Israel, then you punch one more hole in Israel's immigration laws. And that's what the court has been doing in many different ways. The court in Israel is one of the few who said that female circumcision, which is a laundry name for the horror of genital mutilation, it has become a pretext for refugee status. This is a very progressive, extreme interpretation of the refugee covenant. And what this means in Israel is we are surrounded by there are about 400 million women in danger of female genital mutilation around us. And that means that anyone who sets foot on this side of the border gets full protection. Now, everyone wants to protect women from that horror, but Israel can't solve the problem of Africa and Asia inside its 10 million inhabitants. So the court did something completely recklessly, and they keep doing the same thing, and it's the same contingents. The attack on nationalism is always, in the end, an attack on democratic accountability. It's not a logical problem. It's an institutional problem. Once you dissolve the nation state, like the European Union did, to an extent at least, then you weaken democratic accountability. And when you go all the way to Yuval Noah Harari and a perfect utopia of administrators, there will be no democracy at all, which they don't seem to care about because they never raise the issue. Soros will be happy. There's a whole essays on the free flow of goods, services, capital, and ideas.
We have questions in the queue, primarily questions about the connections between these institutions that we're talking about, the university, the media, democratic sovereignty. I have questions in the queue. Do you have any further remarks for one another before we move into the Q&A?
Well, just one brief follow-up on this question of immigration and democracy. I think this maybe gets a little bit into the weeds of the situation in the United States, but the population that comes across the southern border then moves to the various states where it is counted as part of the census and therefore is relevant to the congressional apportionment. And even though these individuals typically can't vote, right, because they're not yet citizens, they give the respective state another representative in Congress. And as they move toward blue states, toward capital D democratic states, this means that there's a vested interest in the Democratic Party in opening the border in order to increase its congressional representation. And given the political situation where the Congress is basically 50-50, this is a way to manipulate the outcome of the legislative process.
folks, we've got some very fine questions here from our audience. A question for Russell: how would you handle the case of an academic department that has become so captured by toxic ideology as to be unreformable? The Middle East Studies Department at Columbia, for instance, is the ideological epicenter of sympathy and even outright support for Hamas. As president of Columbia, what would you do?
Okay, so I can't speak to that department in particular, but I understand the problem. If an administrator has the sense that there's an ideological problem in a unit, in a program or department, of course, you can't just wake up one morning and decide, I'm going to eliminate it. I would try to put together, say, an outside review committee. I'd have to rely on my good judgment and the good judgment of other colleagues who aren't associated with the department to come in and look at the department, look at the CVs, look at the publications, and make a recommendation. What's wrong with this? This unit, and indeed, if it is as toxic as the questioner suggests, I think it's the responsibility of the administration to take appropriate steps. Given structures of tenure, which are a particular form of a labor contract, it'd be very difficult, I think, to get rid of professors, but you can certainly cut back on the funding. You can cut, if they have graduate fellowships, you take away the graduate fellowships. You scrutinize the resources that are being made available. And if they want to stay around without resources, then you figure out what comes next. But I think in that kind of case, any member of that unit who has the capacity to get a job elsewhere would explore that very quickly.
Thanks, Russell, for that answer to a question posed by Cole Bunsell. Unless anyone else has anything they want to add in this respect, we have a question from William Bergman, a related question to any of you. Is it possible to cut organized political activism for all ideologies out of universities while retaining individual free speech? The fact that such organizing has become normal, along with political statements by administrations in support of such extremism, I mean, as we've seen of late, seems like a modern development that is not helpful for free discussion of ideas. Gadi mentioned the obligation to lie, which I think I understand what you mean in terms of journalism, but I think I also understand what it means in terms of the university. Can we, folks, conceive of cutting out political activism in an atmosphere where there is such pressure and incitement to lie in so many ways that we can't go into? But you hear well-intentioned young people even being interviewed on podcasts, Israelis at Columbia, for example, defending themselves, and yet you can still hear echoes of this pressure to lie and distort things that seems to come out of political activism having taken over our institutions. Can we get it out of there without damaging free speech as a right?
Yeah, there's I think there are a number of different levels. There's not going to be one single silver bullet to solve this. I think in terms of what institutions do, in terms of institutional statements, I'm on the side of the Calvin principles from Chicago, that the president of the university should almost never make political statements or restrict those statements to ones that are specifically relevant to the campus community. I don't particularly care what the president of the University of Chicago, for example, might have to say about the situation in Azerbaijan. But if they're not going to speak out on Azerbaijan, why should they speak out on anything else? Just be neutral. Now, the faculty may speak out, the students may speak out, but that's a different matter. Secondly, I'm very skeptical of this blurring of the border between teaching and research on the one hand and activism on the other. You can't prohibit students from being politically active, but I think courses that give credit for activism, that let students out of class in order to go to a demonstration, that's inappropriate. And I think it's inappropriate for faculty to be promoting their political views explicitly in the classroom. I guess I'm Weberian on that point. The faculty member who has a captive audience in a lecture hall should not be telling us who to vote for any office. Where current events aren't directly related to the topic, there's no reason for the faculty member to be expounding on them because they're being paid to teach their stuff. It's not that hard. It's not that hard to figure out what an adult should do. The problem is we have a kind of infantilism on the part of these, grown men and women who are students or who are faculty. No, I don't think you can eliminate activism without hurting free speech. But I think these activists have become such parodies of themselves that they can't be taken seriously, except that they're causing violence and they're disrupting the lives of everybody else on campus who want to study and learn and enjoy the day. There's a profound lack of seriousness. I mean, this really is the TikTok generation of activists.
Yeah, it's something bizarre. Well, in the interest of time, I will resist the temptation to engage you all further on this and pose another question from the queue, if I may. It reads as follows. My reading suggests that the humanities are no longer the leading source of anti-Israelism. The same hostile discourse is present in medical schools, law schools, social work, and public health. Research on education during the pandemic as well suggests this, it seems, even at the university level and below. Would online learning help with that? Or as the questioner says, online learning can't take the place of classroom instruction interaction in a way that would solve our problems. That's the question and a comment from one of our audience members.
Gabi, I want to say something about that, because part of the woke plague has been various forms of disuniting any form of solidarity. It pretends to be solidarity of groups, but it never is. These groups always fragment because every group is not attuned enough to the subtle differences between its members. But what they did with Title IX, I think it was, in universities, and what they did with race relations is I studied in American university. People are afraid of each other. First of all, you're afraid of your students. You just stay away from them because trouble can ensue. Secondly, you see that Black students and white students don't mix because you don't want to say something wrong and step on someone's toes. So there's been and I think the whole postmodern turn has ideologically, and this is a seminar, a webinar about critical theory too. Then the plan of people like Marcuse and Rudi Dutschke were to create groups to tear them away from the mainstream and develop an anti-assimilationist frame of mind. This is why they connect so well with groups of immigrants which don't want to assimilate. So it's a perfect match. You see those Queers for Palestine idiots teaming up with the students, with the jihadists and the Hamas supporters, and the difference just blurs, because the idea, Russell, is not just to attack Western society as such, it's to attack nationalism, it's to attack the family, it's to attack religion, it's to attack any bounds of solidarity that holds society together. And it's a plan to take it apart. And the plan is now succeeding.
I agree with that. The issue is really to erode social bonds in order to have a generalized enemy, generalized alienation. There's not even a socialist utopia, even though some of these organizations call them socialists. But to respond to the question about the spread, the distribution of the anti-Israel position in universities, that's why I say we need more data. I cited two examples, the Columbia and the Indiana documents, but there was a document at Harvard, anti-Israel document at Harvard, that got a lot of support from parts of the medical school. Nonetheless, I think that the STEM part of universities remains closer to sanity than the interpretive parts of universities. We just need to look into that more. Education schools are probably lost, but economic departments aren't.
Yeah.
Okay, folks, we have a number of excellent questions here in the queue. If I may beg your indulgence, just to please allow us to go a little bit over. This material is too important, I think, and interesting, if you'll bear with me and bear with us, if that's okay. We have a few more questions. Tomasz Friedel asks a question for Russell Berman. Is it generally safe to assume that a university's requirement for a diversity statement from an applicant is a sign that the university or department has been captured by the DEI bureaucracy and one need not apply? He adds a question for Gadi Taub. I wonder if you have any thoughts on the capture of, Tomasz Friedel says, to his mind, yeah, coming right up, a significant part of the fields of Holocaust studies and or genocide studies by pro-Palestinian activism. So there's there's a double barrel question.
So very briefly, these diversity statements are indeed a vehicle for ideological litmus testing. Whether it's a sign that the university as a whole has been captured, I can't say, but it's a devious technology of control. I think we may be at a point where universities may be beginning to roll them back, to give up on them, because so much criticism has been leveled at them. Should he nonetheless apply? Yeah, you should apply. Don't have your hopes up, but if you don't apply, you don't have any chance at all.
Okay, well, another question then, if I may. Julius Bielik asks a question. I recently read an interview by Russell Berman from 2019 where he talked about the possibility of the new technologies to make public opinion independent from gatekeepers like the New York Times or Haaretz in Gadi Taub's context. So in the context of what Gadi Taub was talking about in regards to new technologies, is there a good way around these gatekeepers at the same time that new technologies like TikTok are in part responsible for the jihadization of the younger generation? How do we tackle this two-edged sword?
I mean, the new technologies aren't a panacea. There are good ways to use them and there are bad ways to use them. The establishment of independent Substacks or podcasts is a way to get opinion out there that is not controlled by the editorial board of Haaretz. But on the other hand, you have something like TikTok. All that they have in common is that they're associated with new technologies. They're different structures, so we'd have to dig at them closely. One is an opportunity for free dissemination of idea. The other is TikTok is just there for Verdummung in German, making people stupid.
Yeah, I think technology may make it worse because AI is AI is a statistical tool. The core of it is statistical. So it will tend to the lower denominator and towards what it will be taught to be the center. So you already have AI, which doesn't recognize non-Black people. I don't know if you saw these funny things about the Gemini, the Google MI. The Google AI, you ask it to portray the founding fathers of the United States, and they're all Black or Indian, and so on. So I don't think it's going to get better. I think the idea that this is somehow decentralized is not necessarily true.
Just picking up briefly, I'm on Paulina's side of some optimism toward the technological possibilities, but not only for journalism, but for higher education as well. You know, we really don't need these campus country clubs. We could deliver it all in Substacks and podcasts and like plug that into some qualification mechanism, and you know, much less expensive, much more efficient.
Sonia Wentling asks a related question. How does one address then the generational divide? It's a way of rephrasing the question, but let's push on a little further. The TikTok generation's reference points are the pandemic, Black Lives Matter, intersectionality. Russell mentioned it. I mean, oppressor, oppressed. I guess we all of you talked about. It's so simple and so simplistic, but it's so omnipresent. It really is identifiable as the nodal point or a nodal point of all this confusion and emotion and you know, violent rhetoric, if not actual violence. Intersectionality also seems just to be the guiding ideology, and it's so simplistic. How does one address the generational divide? The TikTok generation's reference points are intersectionality, the pandemic, BLM. There's no historical consciousness and context, if you try to look at it from their position, if it's possible, that understands the international order that emerged from World War II. Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Well, Congress is going to make TikTok give up its connection to China. That's indisputably good. Secondly, the young generation is going to get old, so they'll get a little less stupid. And then what's left is, you know, how do you debate this in universities? Why? Well, yeah, for or against intersectionality, and really, who cares? You know, there are colleagues who are so committed to this, to the whole package, as I said before, that there's really not any point to have a discussion with them.
They don't want to talk. They refuse to talk to.
Oh no, they want to talk a lot, but it does you know. Yeah.
They want to talk, yeah. They don't want to listen, yeah. Well, Lorraine Clark wants to listen, I think, to you address her question, if I may pose it to you. Getting rid of the humanities for STEM disciplines surely would erase the necessary centrality of interpreting texts to the practice of hermeneutics that Taub raises. Surely the art of interpreting text, like the art of interpreting empirical reality, can be based on understanding all interpretation as the positing of interpretive hypotheses with a reasonable degree of probability, not certainty. Hypotheses always in principle, revisable on the evidence of new data, empirical or textual. Can't this art of interpretation, bringing together the practices of the sciences and those of the literary and philosophical and of the interpretive, do something perhaps for us? All interpretation is just the formulation of testable, revisable hypotheses. No hermeneutic circle, but no naive empiricism either. Are we back in some ways to this old problem, but in new ways of the split between the sciences and the humanities?
I have a short remark about this. There is a false dichotomy between relativism and empiricism on the two sides, and in the middle lies human experience, and I think that relativism is a self-contradictory idea, and empiricism is also not workable. But in the middle, we still believe that hypothesis can be tested against reality, as E.H. Carr, the historian, once remarked, from the fact that the mountain looks different from different angles, you can't derive the non-fact that the mountain has no objective shape. So since our hypotheses have friction with reality because we live by them, we do have objective tests to them, although we cannot attain a completely objective picture of reality. But our ideas are still tested by objective reality, which is why you probably all remember the Sokal hoax. I interviewed Alan Sokal, and he said, he said to me in this interview, it was in the 21st floor of a building in NYU. He said, if you believe that gravity is just a social construction, why don't you try the hypothesis out of my office window? So obviously, the radical postmodernism is not, it doesn't stand the test of most of our ideas, which is we act on them. And this is, and in this way test them. So the idea that we can there's either a Newtonian physics on the one hand, or total Richard Rorty on the other hand, and only poetry. That idea is just plain wrong. It's wrong philosophically. It contradicts itself. And this is the one great contribution in American philosophy. The only homegrown school of philosophy in America is called pragmatism. And when you try to explain it to students on the fly, because I don't teach philosophy, then I tell them what my teachers at the philosophy department in Tel Aviv said derogatorily about pragmatism. Is the question is not if the chair exists. The question is, can you sit? And if you sit, let's talk about something else. So this America provided us with a healthy way to get out of the false dichotomy between physics and poetry.
I want to make clear that despite what the questioner said, I'm not calling for the elimination of the humanities. Just as tenure is disappearing before our eyes, as the number of tenure track positions is disappeared, being replaced by adjuncts and lecturers, etc., students are not enrolling in humanities courses. If we do not require the humanities courses, there'd even be fewer of them in English, history, etc., because their interests are elsewhere, primarily in STEM, understood broadly to include medicine, the other sciences, etc. Part of this is a fault of what the humanities offer now. Part of it is the increasing interest of students in career options. It's not only, but in the United States and in England, to some extent Germany, we have this notion of the comprehensive university where everything is there, from the medical school to religious studies, from philosophy to physics, all together, and that students move back and forth among the, in France, for example, that's not the case. The elite institutions are not comprehensive. At Polytechnique, at Centrale, at ENA, you don't have the whole package. You focus on one thing. And indeed, even in Germany, you enter the university and you don't have to do 4 years of college where you're required to do XYZ. You become a lawyer, you become a doctor, etc. It's a much more efficient delivery of professional qualification than we get in the United States. In the United States, we expect students to stew in this indolence of 4 years, which is a breeding ground for the kinds of ideological pathologies that we've seen erupt after October 7th. Now, I think there are important elements of knowledge, important truths that one can glean from literature and philosophy, etc. But maybe they don't have to be in universities as such. Maybe they could be in podcasts or Substacks. Maybe there could be, maybe people could pursue literary history in a manner analogous to getting a symphony subscription. It doesn't have to be organized into a comprehensive institution which just provides a campus for kids to make encampments on.
John Elliott asked a question very much to the point here that you're already discussing. I would be interested, John Elliott says, in the thoughts of the panelists and particularly from Professor Berman on the promise or not of the Research Institute, Wissenschaftsinstitut model to circumvent departmental self-applause in the US and elsewhere.
Clearly, our societies need research to be undertaken, but they don't have to be linked to high school or post-high school education. You could have institutes of advanced study, and society could decide how much you want to develop that for the sciences versus how much you want to develop that for the humanities. I think that's that'd be one possible route.
We are just about out of time for the recorded portion. If I may put one final question to you all from Thomas McDonald, then I would invite others with questions, if they wish, to stay after for an informal conversation that's not recorded. Any of the panelists who feel like it are certainly warmly invited, but it's not mandatory. A question then finally to wrap up with this segment and to conclude our formal event for tonight. Earlier, it was mentioned that anti-Semitic rhetoric is or maybe a cover for anti-Christianity. Also, anti-Americanism was a part of the equation. And at least as this plays out in the US, Thomas McDonald says, could you speak a bit more about this and other phenomena of rhetorical subterfuge? I was curious too, Russell, when you said that anti-Christianity was in the mix. I wanted to ask myself if you could say more about that. And as we now wrap up, if any of the others want to comment again on the nexus of anti-Americanism, anti-Christianity, anti-Semitism.
Well, there was the op-ed, I think just yesterday, by Ralph Reed in the Wall Street Journal about the new boogeyman of Christian nationalism. And the left imagines that somehow there are hooded crusaders out there embracing Christianity and trying to seize the state, when in fact, as Reed points out, the documentation of Christian nationalism involved a survey where people asked, do you think Christian values should inform policy? And people could think, how about love your neighbor, kindness, peace. Those are Christian values. This is now being turned into an object of hostility. I think I think there's an anti-Israelism which is easily linked to anti-Americanism. The protesters do it themselves explicitly. There's also an anti-Semitism. And I think that a strong motivation behind anti-Semitism is hostility to Christianity and the ethical obligations of Christianity, and that the problem with Judaism is that it gave birth to Christianity.
As we conclude for now and move into the informal part, for those who wish, that may possibly allow for us to continue thinking about how to synthesize our thoughts about these different troubled institutions, or I would have to say, from listening to your edifying remarks tonight, toxic institutions. Perhaps we'll discuss in the after party how to sort of synthesize our understanding of the interconnectedness. It's important, very, very important at this time to keep struggling to make sense of things that are really menacing but that are worth understanding if we have such fine teachers as the three of you. I couldn't get over what was being called the cosplay dimension of Columbia and of UCLA and the other things. I guess that's what the kids today are calling the kind of farcical dimension of these events. There's something so phony about it all, but it's also deadly serious as we look at the Israel-Hamas war continuing, and all of this somehow factors in. We'll bring these other questions up in the after party as we now say thanks to the panelists, thanks to Gadi, thanks to Russell, thanks to Paulina. I've got some more to think about now, and I already thought I had enough, but thank you for that. And Laila Tov, good night, Bayush,
Laila
except
Tov.
for those who want to stick around.